Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. I'm convinced that if we as Christians hope to cultivate the culture and sow the seed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we must understand the big ideas that have shaped the worldview of people around us. So today, my friend Leroy Hill and I will explore how Niccolo Machiavelli's old ideas on political power have shaped the political waters we swim in. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. So let's start with a little bit of housekeeping. First, for the next bunch of episodes, Benjamin Weiger's book, 10 Books That Screwed Up the World, will provide us with a launching point for cultivating the culture. I picked this book because it's easy to read and allows those unfamiliar with philosophy to join us in this conversation. Throughout the series, we'll cover one chapter a month, so it should be easy for you to keep up with some light reading. So use the link in the show notes to pick up a copy. Second, the reason we decided to use the book to guide our conversations is because the format mirrors what Francis Schaeffer did with his books. He took big ideas and then showed how these ideas played out in the culture. In this way, unlike the 10,000 other news shows and Christian podcasts, we're not letting the news cycle drive our content. The content for Raise the Roof will be driven by big ideas, and then we'll show how these big ideas shape the culture. Finally, the unique piece we're adding is that we're going to use worldview to help us understand each chapter. Specifically, what we're going to do is filter the big ideas through the 6 worldview questions. How did I come into being? What's the purpose for my life? What is the right thing to do? How can I fulfill my purpose? How will my life be judged? What happens when I die? If you're new to Raise the Roof, then check out episode 6, titled Your Quest Begins with Worldview, where I explore each of these questions. With that framework in mind, today we cover The Prince, written by Niccolo Machiavelli. The book was written in 1513 to a Roman Catholic pope as a pragmatic and ruthless guide to taking and maintaining power. Machiavelli's book reflects his political naturalism, a term I'm going to unpack later in the show with Leroy. Machiavelli himself was well educated in the humanities, including the Latin and Italian classics. He courted favor with the house of Medici, but eventually they grew weak and fell from power in 1494. So at that time, a Dominican friar named Guillermo Savonarola rose to power and filled that vacuum. He despised the opulence of the Medici family, and on February 7th, 1494, burned thousands of books, musical instruments, mirrors, and artwork in a public square in Florence in what has become known as the Bonfire of the Vanity. So Machiavelli opposed Savonarola, which left him on the political outs. Savonarola was eventually excommunicated by the Pope and executed in May of 1497. Since Machiavelli was not connected to Savonarola, though, he was able to regain some notoriety among the Signoria, which is the ruling class in Florence. So in 1498, Machiavelli was appointed second chancellor of the Republic of Florence. Eventually, he married into even greater wealth. In the years to come, Florence experienced war and political turmoil. Eventually, the House of Medici was restored to power, but that didn't go very well for Machiavelli, who was suspected of treason and thrown into jail. And a little bit of our book, The 10 Books That Changed the World, covers a little bit of this background. So if you've read that, you'll get this as well. But to elicit this confession, Machiavelli was subjected to a punishment called the strappato. His wrists were bound together behind his back and attached to a rope hanging from a ceiling pulley. He was hauled up in the air, dangling painfully from his arms, and suddenly dropped back to the ground, thereby pulling his arms out of their sockets. Okay, that's not a fun torture to go through. So obviously he's still out of power. Machiavelli hoped his book, though, The Prince, which was originally dedicated to Giuliano de' Medici in about 1513, 1514, would win him a seat of power with the Medici family. In 1516, though, he rededicated his book to Lorenzo the Magnificent of the Medici family with this opening plea. Desiring, therefore, to present myself to your magnificence with some testimony of my devotion towards you, I have not found among my possessions anything which I hold more dear than or value so much as the knowledge of the actions of great men, acquired by long experience in contemporary affairs and a continual study of antiquity, which, having reflected upon it with great and prolonged diligence, I now send, digested into a little volume, to your magnificence. So obviously, Machiavelli doing a little brown nosing here, but unfortunately for him, Lorenzo was far more interested in his hunting dogs than Machiavelli's political philosophy. As a result, Machiavelli lived the remaining years as an historian, a playwright, an occasional advisor to the Pope, but largely a political outsider. In 1520, Machiavelli did regain some sort of influence with Cardinal Julio de' Medici, saying all these Italian names wrong, but anyway, who became Pope Clement the Seventh in 1525. But by and large, Machiavelli's political writings remained unknown until The Prince was published 5 years after his death in 1532. All right, so that's a little bit of a background on Machiavelli himself and tells you a little bit about his story and why he maybe wrote the things he wrote. But what are the major themes that are in this book that might help us understand this worldview analysis we're going to do in just a few minutes? So Machiavelli believed that all states, all powers that have ruled over men fall into two basic categories, republics or principalities. And the prince, as you might gather from the title of the book, was only concerned with the latter form of governments, principalities. So at the outset, it's clear that the prince was the antithesis to the Christian commitment to moral absolutes and belief in the future kingdom of God, both of which Machiavelli believed placed unnecessary limits on the power of the prince. Machiavelli's work was really then the antithesis to Aristotelian politics, which emphasized the virtuous life. He was not driven by philosophical or moral ideals of goodness or justice. He was instead driven by the tactics of the brutal and immoral men he witnessed rise to power. He wrote, quote, "The fact is that a man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. Therefore, if a prince wants to maintain his rule, he must be prepared not to be virtuous, and to make use of this or not according to need. To be great," Machiavelli concludes then, "a prince must be focused on the here and now of political power." Machiavelli emphasized the idea that a prince must be purposeful and determined and unwavering. He must also be cruel and swift and firm in his actions. He says it this way, quote, "In general, you must either pamper people or destroy them. Harm them just as little and they'll hit back. Harm them seriously and they won't be able to. So if you're going to harm people, make sure you needn't worry about their vengeance." Now, to be clear, Machiavelli wasn't just about the brutality. Winning the favor of the people with art, entertainment, and reward is only good, though, he said, for making sure the prince is not hated. But favor alone, he warned, won't preserve power. Attempts to buy the people's love will ruin the kingdom, so an army must be raised to defend the throne when cruelty is required. He famously advised that it is better for a prince to be feared than loved, because fear is a more reliable means to maintain control. In chapter 16, Machiavelli concludes this: "A prince should guard himself above all things against being despised and hated, and liberally giving from his own wealth leads to both. Therefore, it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness, which brings reproach without hatred." So what he's saying here is a successful ruler must shape his own destiny through strength, deception, pragmatism, and violence when necessary. Keeping one's word, he says, can only be dangerous because experience shows that those who do not keep their word get the better of those who do. Wow, that's pretty strong, right? He's saying you got to be prepared to lie. And if you're a truth teller, you must be prepared to lose your power. So Machiavelli had no place for God or Christian virtues such as honesty and humility, but he did believe a state religion was an important tool for keeping power over the people. In part, he was inspired by the many Roman Catholic despots he met, such as Cardinal Cezanne Borgia or Julius II, the warrior pope whom he saw as the ideal prince. Machiavelli argued that to gain loyalty, it's important that a ruler have the appearance of virtue, yet be willing to act immorally in secret. A prince, he opined, must always seem to be very moral, even if he is not. So that's his framework. And with that background, let's join the discussion with my friend Leroy. There he is. And Leroy, welcome and happy anniversary, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Leroy's traveling. He's got a little hotel action going. It's not a speedway behind him. It's not a raceway that you may hear, but occasional car. But I guess that's the price of being on a podcast that's live when you travel, right?
Yep. There you
All
go.
right. Well, let's just jump right in with Machiavelli's answer to our first worldview question: how did I come into being? And this question is one on ontology, the nature of being, that sort of thing. So, Leroy, what is his view on God and origins? Was Machiavelli, as you read him, an atheist, a Roman Catholic, an evangelical conservative Republican, or or something else entirely? What's
It's a,
his position?
that's a good question because you would immediately think that when after reading him that he's a God hater or doesn't believe in God at all. But being a worldview issue, we kind of look at the things that surround him or the times in history in which he lives and to see how we can place his thought within that time and within that framework. So imagine a person who writes this book, The Prince. What is it? 4 years before Martin Luther King,
Yeah.
Martin Luther, you know,
Yeah, it's
stamps
right
the
at the birth of
95.
the Reformation, right?
It's at the cusp of the Reformation, and once we can place him in that time and frame in history, and we can look at his view of the church, and what we mean by the church, we mean the Catholic Church, and he sees the Catholic Church as another rival for power. He doesn't see it as a religious institution, a place where God is exalted. He sees it as a rival for political power. I think the Pope in his time is Pope something the sixth. I have it in my notes here. That's why I had
There's
to
a
pull it
couple
up.
different popes that he covered when he started.
Right, Pope Alexander, and he looks at the corruption of Pope Alexander the Sixth, and again he just sees the church as a rival for political power. So in one sense, his worldview as reflected through his understanding of the church would not necessarily, as insane as it is, would not necessarily rule out the idea of the existence of God. It just wouldn't use the idea of existence of God to
Yeah,
make any moral claims on his worldview. He thinks it's just another rival for power.
yeah. So in that sense, yeah, he's definitely sort of this. He's a theist of some kind under this
Hmm.
Roman Catholic label. But
Hmm.
the way I kind of was thinking it to myself, he's saying if there is a God, he really has nothing to do with the life of politics. That's kind of this framework that he has. I kind of labeled him in my own mind. I think like a proto-deist. Think of the deism of Hobbes and of
It's a good
some of the early
label.
founders, and of course Machiavelli was a big influence on some of these later like Hobbesian political philosophy, and he was an influence on some of these American founders. And I think that's that deistic sort of the proto pre-deistic framework that you get, where he's just practical, pragmatics. The practical is all that matters. Matter of fact, you grew up hearing that phrase, God helps those who help themselves, right?
Hmm.
As I was reading Machiavelli, The Prince along, I kept that phrase just jumped to mind several times. God helps those who helps themselves. So sure, there's a God out there, but it's really you got to do it. You've got to make it happen. And that's where I came up with this idea of political naturalism, that science and
Hmm.
religion world, right? We have methodological naturalism or philosophical naturalism. And the difference is that in the science and religion debate is, a Christian says, well, hey, I certainly believe in God. Metaphysically, I'm a Christian. I'm not a naturalist. But so philosophically, I believe he's there. But methodologically, to do good science, I have to assume as if things that God doesn't exist. I have to assume there's no supernatural explanation for
Hmm.
anything. And so I think he's doing that in the political world. So it's a
Right.
political naturalism in that sense where, oh, sure, God exists, but to operate and be a successful prince or ruler, I have to act like God doesn't exist to be successful. That's
Exactly.
kind of what I had in mind. What do you think
No,
about that
that's
framework?
accurate. That's accurate. And when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking of his worldview as reflected in the life of the church that he's observing. And if you look at the popes that he dealt with, and he watched work, and he knew their corruption, their infidelities, their pursuit of power is in manipulation and cunning and all these other sorts of political marriages and alliances. He just sees it as another government. So imagine what God is like reflected in that worldview. I mean, imagine what God is like reflected in that. And he says, okay, this is what God must be like. These are the guys who are the experts in the religion, so to speak. And if they're acting this way, this is what God must be like. Now, that's not an excuse, right? Let's just, say that up front.
Yeah.
But we're not looking to excuse his thought, but we're looking to explain it, right? We're looking
Yeah.
to kind of understand it. So it's not an excuse, but in considering worldview, it is a good example of how people view us today, in the church. They see us, divided, fighting, debating. Many
Yeah.
want to claim that we're just like everybody else pursuing power, and all these other sorts of things. So they see us as another rival for their own, power in the world.
Well, that's a great lead in, though, then to the second worldview question. How can I know the purpose for my life? And that's a worldview question we're asking, like, how do I know what God wants for, if you're a Christian in this sense, how do I know what God wants for me? What's the purpose? So for me, as I thought about this, again, going back to growing up, you hear this. I remember hearing this phrase, knowledge is power. Remember, they used to have commercials
Hmm.
on this, knowledge is
Hmm.
power. And, but the ideal that guides our politics, and I think Machiavelli, is that power is knowledge. In other words,
Right.
purpose is found in the acquisition of power. And as you acquire power, that sets your purpose in life. That's what sets, and that's kind of what you were just outlining. That's why I wanted to transition to this question, because I think you're exactly right in that thing. We do it as in the church, we do it in the secular world, and it's a competition for power. So it's not knowledge that's power, it's power that is true knowledge. Power is the knowledge. It gives me the acquisition of information I need to succeed in life. And that's sort of the framework I think that works for Machiavelli, and I think is in operation today.
Yeah, that's the teleological question. Teleological meaning the purpose or the goal for which, right? For Machiavelli, you said it. It's political naturalism. His goal and his purpose is to do whatever attains power, maintains it, and preserves power for the state. And if you think of that as his animating idea, it's not to serve God. It's not to do good for people. It is not to have a great name even. It's to preserve, maintain, and attain power. If you think that, if you at bottom say that that's his pursuit, then everything else that he does and every argument that he makes, whether it is amoralistic pragmatism, evil, or even the use of good to achieve those three goals, then we've got Machiavelli nailed. We know exactly where he's coming from. And then the rest of his work, it makes sense in that light. The rest of his work and his ideas make sense in that particular light.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too. And when I was reading a little bit more of the history of this, trying to reacquaint myself with some of this stuff, and I haven't delved deeply into this, a lot of it in the past, but I've heard things here or there, as many of us have over life. But I was really intrigued by the conflict that happened between the Medici family, and by the way, people are familiar with the Medici family because I think there's a HBO Cinema, it's one of those. I don't know, have a series called The Medicis, and a lot of these papal power families exist in TV series, which are really mature audience type shows. But they bring these, but that's how these people were. It's horrible. But there was a competition for power early on between the Medicis, and there's a guy named Savonarola. And Savonarola, I think, in some ways, is like this the political right today. So I think there's these competing forces. So you got Savonarola, who's on the political right, and we today, I think, have abandoned moral principles, though, for the sake of the republic. Right? Savonarola was willing to do this. He's all everything for the sake of the republic, to keep the republic going. Sort of that was the ultimate goal, and you're willing to compromise. And he certainly didn't exemplify Christian values in the way he tried to get rid of the hedonism of the day. He had book burnings. He did all this other kind of stuff. And I think our political right today is in some ways headed towards our own sort of modern bonfire of the vanities. That experience where Savonarola burned all the art and all this sort of stuff, all in the name of good moral virtue, but he was willing to sacrifice certain freedoms for doing that. The left is more like the spirit of the Medici family. It's the illusion, they're willing to present the illusion of moral virtue, democracy and liberalism, but all that gets, of course, now in the last few years been stripped away and revealed their blatant lust for power. But problem is for both sides, whether we are on the Savonarola side or the Medici side, I think we're all in sort of this Machiavellian political where winning is the greatest moral good and the suffering of the people sort of be damned.
Just reading the history surrounding this and the brutality of it and the willingness to use any means, any method to accomplish whatever my political ends are. Intrigue. You murder your friends. You murder the people who get you into power. Reward, bribery. It is just insane. And I guess the thing that you really point out that's amazing is how one set of views can be dominant. If you think about this period is called the Renaissance period. It is the epic of humanism. It's the epic of pragmatism. It is a breaking away from so-called religious authority. And it's like you said, at least the religious people were willing to uphold some sort of veneer of decent, even though behind the scenes they were just as brutal and
Yeah.
as wicked. But here you just have the naked pursuit of power.
Yeah, purpose in the pursuit of power seems to be that answer to that question. And that, of course, now you're kind of moving into our next worldview question. What's the right thing to do? What's the moral good? What's the moral bad? And there's two really competing worldviews. And you brought this up a little bit when we were introing your ideas here and answering our first worldview question. How did I come into being? And answering where does God fit in the picture of this? I think the two worldviews in competition are the might makes right view versus good leadership is exemplified by moral virtue. In this case, the older, I guess, more Christian view is that to be a good prince, to be a good leader, you must have moral character. Machiavelli was really revolutionary in that he's saying, no, it's might makes right. And there is a big contrast. Now, he wasn't writing in a vacuum. So as I was looking into this, Erasmus, we all know that name as Christians, right? Erasmus is writing a competing view at almost this exact same time. But he has a work called The Education of a Christian Prince. He published it in 1516, which is published just a few years after Machiavelli publishes his work, The Prince. So Erasmus is really this competing idea. But here's what he writes. What is that which alone makes a prince if it is not the consent of his subjects? So in other words, you're not a prince unless your subjects, the people that you rule over, agree to it, right? In this sort of democratic, sort of Republican sort of view of leadership, right? But he says this, a man who is great because of his own good qualities, that is his virtues, will be great even if his princely authority is stripped from him. So in other words, for Erasmus, he's saying there is a moral virtue that undergirds a great man. To be a great man, so whether you are a prince or not, it's that same moral virtue should guide you. And again, in his work, Erasmus says this, reward to a tyrant is wealth. Now, when we hear the word tyrant, think of Machiavelli's version of the prince. So reward to a tyrant is wealth. To a king, honor, which follows upon virtue. The tyrant's rule is marked by fear, deceit, and machinations of evil. The king governs through wisdom, integrity, and beneficence. The tyrant uses his imperial power for himself, the king for the state. The tyrant guarantees safety for himself by means of foreign attendants and hired brigands. The king deems himself safe through his kindness to his subjects and their love for him in return. These citizens who are distinguished for their most moral character, judgment, and prestige are held under suspicion and distrust by the tyrant. Now that's Erasmus at the same time as Machiavelli. But here's Machiavelli. He says the exact opposite. A prince wishing to keep a state is very often forced to do evil. You must know there are two ways of contesting, the one by the law and the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse in the second. So, and sometimes the prince must be the beast. Those are two competing ideas at the same time, at the exact same moment in history, Erasmus versus Machiavelli. What do you think about that? I don't know if you've read what Erasmus had done or not, but does that surprise you that they're writing this at the same time?
At the same time, absolutely, it surprises me. But I want to say this: when you read what people say about Machiavelli, you hear ideas presented. Some people would say that Machiavelli was the total realist, which is, of course, the king wants to be good, but the king is going to do evil in pursuit of his own ends. Some people would say that Machiavelli was a satirist. He wrote this as a joke. He never really intended, because no one can be totally amoral, right? No one can be totally pragmatic in their views. And others will say that he's sort of a genius. He's a genius because he's writing in this political, naturalist, pragmatic, at the beginning of statecraft and diplomacy. So you have all these wide and varied views of Machiavelli. And some will even say that he's, demonic. His views are just absolutely wicked. I guess the point that I'm raising is, if we take your original point, which is to say that he's working under methodological politics, in other
The
words,
political naturalism,
everything
yeah,
for the
yeah.
statecraft, everything for the pursuit of the state, everything for the pursuit of the maintenance, attaining, and preserving power, then he's when contrasted by Erasmus, he would be an absolute tyrant. But then, I mean, from a biblical standpoint, obviously God isn't leaving us without a witness. As a matter of fact, I'm actually pretty happy about it. I'm actually, because I didn't know that he had written.
Yeah, I had really come to that later too. I'm familiar with Erasmus and I've read some of his stuff in seminary back in those days and here and there, but I wasn't familiar with this particular work. So I came across it and I was like, oh, this is really fascinating, especially once I saw the timeline, because I saw that this isn't just, you can't explain Machiavelli just as a man of his time. Matter of fact, he knows that he's intentional. He's specifically saying those people like Erasmus. He doesn't name Erasmus, but I'm saying people like that who believe that kings should be guided by idealistic views of good and bad, by ideals of right and wrong. He thinks they're foolish. And I get it because he has lived it, man. He has tried to get in political power. He was tortured for his being out on the political outside. He's trying to get his way back in. And this whole work is a piece of brown nosing work. I mean, he's, oh, great, magnificent Pope. I want to be your such wise person who will guide you. And that's all I want to do is serve you. And it's just this whole idea of being the number two. And I never want power for myself. I only want it for you. And he's just such a brown noser in this whole thing. But he doesn't, he's all pragmatism. And he thinks that it's naive if you think you can hold to your ideals, because if you hold your ideals, you'll lose power, which happened to him, which is why he's so opposed to this. He's been so brutalized by his own sense of right and wrong. I think in the past, where he held to a certain side, he's like, okay, now I'm just going to be a pure pragmatist because I want the power. I don't want to be tortured again and put in jail and all that other kind of stuff. The problem, though, I see is, in my view, this idea, this Machiavellian sort of political pragmatism that we've seen in my lifetime used to be reflected by a small percentage of the left. Not even the large percentage, just a small percentage on the left, but you saw it at stake. And I think over time, through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, it became a larger and larger percentage as power was gained more by the left. And then you saw the right say, well, we're always losing. We're always getting beat to death by the left. We need to play on an even playing field. We need to use their tactics. And then you had a small percentage of the right start to take on these Machiavellian tactics. And now I think there's a larger percentage on the right. And I mean that both in the Christian and the non-Christian side. This I wrote, I got this the other day from the Christian Post. I saw this headline, and I read this article, Leroy, and I wanted to share this with you because I don't know if you've seen it. Because I'm concerned today, not just with the, of course, secular people, moral right and wrong, pragmatism, I get it, that's their worldview. But here we have Machiavelli, who has a Christian quote unquote framework, this sort of deist, proto deist God guiding these things. But I think we're moving towards that in our political naturalism of today for Christians. Anyway, so the Christian Post, this is the title of the article: The Art of War and Why Republicans Must Learn It. Now, Machiavelli wrote a book called The Art of War. So it's not just Sun Tzu's Art of War, but Machiavelli had an Art of War book as well. So that language is really interesting. But this is from the Christian Post, talking about the art of war and why Republicans must learn it. Here's what it says in part. At this juncture in time, there is no common ground. There is no agreement between Democrats and Republicans on representing the best interests of the American people or even what those best interests are. Now there is only war, and Republicans are losing. It is necessary now for Republicans to, in the words of William Shakespeare, imitate the actions of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard favored rage. Now they're quoting Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is really quoting, so to speak, Machiavelli, who talks about that animal. There's the human and there's the animal, and sometimes we have to be the animal. He said, if you're going to be the animal, be the lion and the fox. He talked about the lion and the fox, but it's this Machiavellian idea that we have to be fierce and animalistic to survive this political time. Now, they're not saying abandon our moral principles. They're just saying they just have to be set aside for now. And then once we obtain power, then we can go back to the moral integrity that we hold dear to us. That's a Christian publication making that argument. What do you think about that?
I'm not surprised because the temptation to lay down your principles when evil is you believe evil is being done to you is very, very tantalizing. Now, if they were to talk about justice, when you get in power and justice, and I'm okay with that. But they're not really talking about justice. They're talking about retaliation. It's not biblical. Vengeance
Yeah.
is mine, saith the Lord, right? What you described is what Machiavelli would call virtue. Now, he doesn't mean virtue in terms of the refinement of the soul and the development of the person, and the moral characteristics of that individual. No, he means the beast. He's talking about being bold. He's talking about being assertive. He's talking about taking advantage when an opportunity or something that he calls fortuna presents itself. He's saying that in those situations, you have to be an absolute savage, if necessary, in order to attain power. And for the Christian to utilize this as his own strategy for power, it's to say two wrongs make a right. And trust me, when you see injustice on the scale that we see, that again, the temptation is there, but we need to understand that that is what James would call the lust of the flesh. It's demonic, earthly wisdom that is going to our destruction, and our nation's destruction in the future. So for supposedly Christian people who are saying this is the pursuit that we must, pursue, that's wrong. If you were to ask me again, my view is justice. I mean, if we're going to get into power and we get into power, the thing is not vengeance, it's not retaliation. It's to act justly. If people broke the law, no matter what side they are, then they should pay the penalty for breaking the law. If there are investigations that need to be had, then let's investigate that. But let's not do to them what they did to us, because how does that make us any better?
Yeah, it's tough because Machiavelli, because he's trying to just give practical advice, there are things that he says are decent advice. But the problem is there's no moral foundation for that advice. It's just saying what works at the moment. So, for example, his advice, we have to adapt to the times. We don't want to use outdated methods of leadership. And he talks about warfare and other things, about using contemporary methods like, hey, this worked then, this won't work now. Okay, that's all well and good. But that good advice is lost on the bad advice because there's literally no moral guardrails for that change. So here's a quote that he says, and I'll get your take on this quote. He says, I conclude, therefore, that fortune, this is kind of what you were alluding to a second ago, He goes that fortune being changeful and mankind steadfast in their ways, so long as the two are in agreement, men are successful. So in other words, the ways of man, as long as they align with the fortunes of the time, the culture of the day, the cultural context, hey, you're going to be successful. But you're going to be unsuccessful when they fall out. For my part, I consider that it's better to be adventurous than cautious because fortune is a woman. Now, this is actually, I've read this quote too because his view on women is really interesting for those that are into Machiavellian politics. So just be ready for this one. So, fortune is like a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill use her. And it is seen that she allows herself to be mastered by the adventurous rather than those who go to work more coldly. So women like bad boys. So better be a bad boy who abuses his woman to keep her under a thumb. That is like what leadership is like. You have to adapt to the times, and if that's what the woman wants, you got to give her what she wants. Oh, she's asking for it, is what she's saying. So he says the culture. Well, the people are asking for it. They need us to be bold and brutal leaders. So if that's what they need, we must be that thing for them.
One of the tests of a worldview is whether it's livable. Machiavelli's pragmatism, pure pragmatism, is unlivable. What Machiavelli is suggesting is that there really are no moral foundations which undergird the way that we live. We ought to live immorally. In other words, whatever will allow us to, get what we want, that's what we ought to do. And that's completely unlivable. And as a matter of fact, I was thinking that people would immediately point to dictators in the past and say, these guys lived that way, but they actually didn't. Not a single one. Each one was willing to set aside their ethical concerns to pursue their own end, right? But they still had ends, right? They still had ethical concerns. They knew that they were doing evil. It's just that what they desired was more profitable in the moment than doing the good. So
Mm-hmm.
whereas Machiavelli is saying there is no good and evil, there's only what you do. Dictators in the past knew that they were evil and they knew that their deeds were evil. They just chose to do otherwise. Now, what's the point? Can you imagine a government that actually lived by Machiavellian standards? I think you brought up earlier, this book is the result of a guy who was beaten, tortured, lost his wealth, driven for power. And this book, much like Karl Marx's book, which Karl Marx's book is built on resentment, this is a book that is reflective of someone who is resentful in the same way, using the same means to attain, and preserve and maintain power. It's
Yeah.
resentment that undergirds all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. The couple first, you've kind of moved us again because you're so brilliant, Leroy, into our next worldview question: how can I fulfill my purpose? Right? What's the means to do that? That's really what you've been talking about, right? How do I fulfill that purpose? Well, I got to do what it takes. I have to do that. I can allow people to think I value God or think that I'm a religious, morally good purpose, but that's only an artifice because people need to see that. People need to see, Machiavelli believed there should be religion. He believed it was necessary, sort of like the opiate of the masses kind of thing, right? You find a lot of Marxist, neo-Marxist ideas so he was like this proto-Marxist too. We can call him a proto-deist, a proto-Marxist, whatever. But this idea of being ruthless. He wasn't for brutality, pure brutality. And that's where he is. He's, oh, be kind. Oh, look, he says be kind. Yeah, but all of those things are tools of manipulation for him. But he does say, look, you have to be ruthless in times, but let it be for short periods of time, right? Because people get overwhelmed if the brutality is never ending. They have to have this sense of hope. But when there is an opportunity, be brutal. Make sure that your enemy can't get back at you. And Stalin actually was the perfect example of this. I was watching this video about the life of Stalin, and there was a time he was giving a speech, and there was a time where he punished the first person who stopped applauding him with 10 years in prison. So he was looking out in the audience. The first guy that stopped says, "Get that guy, put him in prison for 10 years." Right? So it was like everyone else was like, "Well, I'm not going to be the first one to stop." You only have to do it once, and then the people realize that. And today, I think we see that in our demand to signal our virtue, right? This idea of virtue signaling today. I'm not going to be the one who doesn't stand up for this. I have to use the exact language approved by the elites or risk punishment. Social media is used by the government to rule by fear. And I think we see this idea that, like, it doesn't matter if we're right or wrong. It doesn't matter who's right. I just have to make somebody an example. I just have to take that one lady who prayed outside an abortion clinic and put her in jail, like the Biden administration has done. And then when she's sentenced to 10 years in jail for praying outside of an abortion clinic, who else is going to dare to do that? Right? I don't have to do it even-handedly. I don't have to punish everybody. I just have to make one person an example of what not to do, and then I will succeed in my ruthless maintenance of power. And we see that so much, and it's really frightening, to be honest.
You know what, you were talking, and I don't even know why I didn't connect this before. This is hood mentality. This is, street mentality. There's a term called getting it out of the mud, right? In other words, when people say I got it out the mud, what they mean is I had to do grimy things to get what it is I got. And because we all got to get what we get, no matter how we get it, you're not to judge me on how I got it. If I've had to shoot and murder, you're not to judge me. You're not to judge me in light of that because I got it out the mud. I just got it. Let's party about it. They're going to argue in a completely Machiavellian way that I'm a realist. This is just how it is. This is how I got to get it. And that, in many ways, is why you see the death and destruction, in our city streets, because you have this Machiavellian principle at work, which you just connected to the same sorts of ideas that animate us politically to destroy our enemies, to use social media to censor, because at bottom, it is about the attainment, the preservation, and the maintenance of power.
Yeah.
Power.
Yeah. Now, I think one other thing that's interesting too is there are some observations that Machiavelli does make when he talks about how do we fulfill our purpose as a state, right? As a nation. So at the founding, there was a conflict that Machiavelli observed that I think the founders tried to balance. They tried to prevent this sort of rule by power in the structure of the government. So Machiavelli says that the prince rules with power, but the people, he observed, were more interested in defending liberty than free speech, right? And free speech. That was their goal. That's what the people wanted to defend. And so Florence at the time was a republic. And he says this: a people are more prudent, more stable, and better judgment than a prince. That was from his discourses. So he's saying, look, to have a collection of people from all over, generally they'll lead us to a better place than a ruler by himself. Now, it's an interesting little thing coming from Machiavelli, but partly he was trying to do this, again, to self-preservation, right? Because he didn't want to be overrun by the prince, again, like it happened to him in the past. So he felt that like some sort of virtue could be found, a consensus of the people, a republic. Again, not necessarily the scripture or God or the teachings of the church, but the consensus of the people. Now, I don't know that he's even right about the consensus of the people, but what he ended up doing is saying basically the security, the power of the prince is threatened by the liberty of the people. So he's saying these two things are at odds. And I think he's somewhat right about that. When people have power, power is threatened by liberty. And we see this desire to suppress certain liberties, free speech. Speech is violence on the campuses of our our universities today. We see that these signs come up. Well, your speech hurts me, therefore I must restrict your speech. Your liberty impinges on my power, my access to power. So when you look at the founding of the United States, the founders built our republic, a republican democracy, to thrive with rhetorical persuasion, right? Congress was the moderating power for the president, who was the prince. Congress was supposed to be slow to change, right? Because they had to persuade somebody else. It wasn't by pure power, and they could constrain the power of the prince, the president, who would do it. So that's how the country was set up. So I think that when we look at the founding, we see that these checks and balances were really about checks and balances on the observations Machiavelli made about these competing interests of the people versus those who are in power. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you bring this up because I read an essay by a guy named Macaulay, and I'm thinking that Macaulay is just going to savage Machiavelli, but he doesn't savage him. What he does is he talks about what's going on in Italy at the time of Machiavelli. He thinks that power should be shared because he would believe in something like an oligarchy. In other words, he's going to use influential, wealthy people to maintain power. There has to be someone who's leading it, right? But he's going to utilize patronage to influence people. Now, it's not a pure oligarchy in which there are families that are sharing power, but he's going to see that the more people that are invested in this sort of structure, the wider we're going to be able to control, maintain, influence people toward our particular pursuits. So I think again, you're 100% right. The founders looked at that. They understood Machiavelli's works, and what they did was they prevented power from coalescing in the hands of one individual, which is where the separation of powers come. And I'm not saying that that's directly an influence from Machiavelli, but what it is it's a recognition that you can't have power centralized in the hands of one person, and the more power that is real power that is invested in the hands of many other power who can influence decisions, the better it is for the people.
So let's jump off on that for a second, because this is where I want to tie it in to the church specifically. Because I do think a lot of our churches are run in that very same way. And I'm not talking about just having a solo pastor being in charge, in principle, whatever. I'm a plurality of elder guys. That's my book is on that. I think shared leadership is the biblical model. The pastor CEO model I think is inherently unhealthy for guys. That's why we see a lot of burnout. Okay, all that aside. But there is specifically a strain of Christian leadership that advocates for this sort of Machiavellian power play. As I've taught over the years in seminary and other places, the idea of a shared leadership model, one of the pushback I always get is, well, but if I have to make decisions with it, if I'm no longer the sole decision maker, I'll never get stuff done. Or what if I want to do something or people disagree with me and they don't want to share that leadership because they want to have the power to direct the church the way they feel that they should do it. But even worse, we know, you and I both know some people in common here, but there are pastors who literally their whole ideal of leadership is you don't grow too big where you can't control it. If anything grows so big that you can't control it, you must crush it. So if there's a ministry that gets out of like where a lot of people really love it, if there's a associate pastor or some leader that people really like, that they start to gravitate towards that person because they're leading really well, then you have to crush that person. If they ever have a desire, I've read stuff by pastors I will not name, but I've read stuff from pastors. Their whole leadership is like, hey, if you guys have guys that you're sharing leadership with, if they ever have a desire to be the senior guy, you need to get rid of them. They can't live in your world anymore. And they're very strict about this. Matter of fact, I interviewed at a church once when I was unemployed one time. I interviewed at a church, and I knew this church had a reputation of being a very brutal leadership guy because I knew a guy who worked there. Every year, the same jobs came up on these job forums because guys couldn't live past about a year at this place because it was really bad. But I needed a job, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to suck it up. I can do it for a job. So I go into interview with this church, and this is a church in San Diego, very popular pastor. There's like 5,000 or so people go to this place. He's a very popular speaker. He works with sports teams in the area. One team that's since left the area. I won't give any names, but people can figure it out if they want. I don't care. But I'm not going to name a name right now. But I go into this interview, and this is literally what he says, Leroy. Okay, your job is to be the black hat. My job is to be the white hat. And what he means by this is if I say to you, go and tell somebody you're fired, you're a terrible at your job, you have to be this brutal hatchet man. I mean, he uses this language. I am the hatchet man. And I am going to be that. But you have to understand they're going to come to me and I'm going to be the white hat. And I'm going to say things like, yeah, that Joe guy, he's out of control. I get it. He's just so mean and terrible. So I will be comforting these people that I've told you to fire. I will be the one pretending that like I had nothing to do with this because I need to be loved by the people. So you have to be the one that's hated by people. This is literally how he's describing my job to do this role. So he can maintain the artifice of moral virtue and shield himself from the blowback. And then, of course, he'll get rid of me when it's bad enough. Oh, look, I'm protected. Oh, that guy was so, look at all the terrible things he did. But don't worry, I've gotten rid of him. Love me more, love me more. I'll bring in somebody new. That was his that was his approach to leadership. Very Machiavellian. And I'll tell you, that style of leadership has been taught in certain seminaries in the past. And that sort of Machiavellian pastoral care and leadership is what we see a lot in different places. And it really is scary.
There's a book by a guy named Raridan. It's called Servant Leadership. And in that book, Raridan discusses a concept called a mental mindset for leadership. And throughout the book, he compares the mental mindset that God would have his leaders have versus the mindset that we see with guys like, say, Haman or guys like Saul, and they'd be contrasted with a biblical carrier. And what you find at the bottom of those mental mindsets is that those people don't retain God in their thinking. The sheep are mine to control instead of God's sheep to be loved and are of inestimable value and worth. These sheep have an instrumental use. That instrumental use is to accomplish my ends. And insofar as they serve that instrumental use, then they're absolutely valuable. And as you begin to track these mental mindsets, what you find is that there is no biblical worldview. There's no biblical ideal in which they are adhering to underneath this mental mindset. It is one that is man centered, it is fleshly, it is evil, it's demonic. And you know what? I'm getting angry. I got to stop. I'm getting angry as I think about it because this is prevalent. It's prevalent churches. It's prevalent in churches, and I've known so many people who have experienced the evil machinations.
Give
I
me
won't
one
say
example,
this
Leroy.
person's
Come on,
name.
give me one good example. You don't have to name a name. Just give me an example here, so people know that this is you're not just making this up.
So I know a person who worked at a church. Their spouse was an absolute fool, and this person did their job well, loved the people whom God gave to love. A new pastor came in. He wanted to get rid of all the people in leadership because he was instituting a new theological perspective. So he needed to jettison people from ministry who wouldn't fit in with his new theological perspective. So he fingered this person to be ejected. And I went to that person leaving the ministry celebration, for bigger and better things, knowing full well that this person was ejected so he could put another person in that seat. Now, here's the crazy thing: the person that he put in the seat was a placeholder too. This person that he put in the seat was put in the seat just until his spouse was ready to take over. So he used my friend's friend to undercut their role in ministry only for a time so that when his wife was ready to take over that role, he could jettison the woman. I shouldn't even say that. He could jettison the person who uh, who jettisoned my friend, right? And destroy both of those people in order to ultimately enshrine his
Yeah.
own spouse into that role. It's so clear and obvious. And what bothers me so much is they take advantage of our naivete. They take advantage that we think that what they're doing is good. This is God's plan. When it isn't God's plan, it's their wicked machinations. And I could tell you story. I once, and this is the last thing I'll say. I once knew a pastor who knew that he was destroying, the executive pastor's marriage by the workload that he was putting him under, and the black hat thing. We're talking about the same guy. The black hat thing that he put that guy under. He was destroying that guy's marriage. He knew he was, and he didn't care. And his goal, as he said it, was, we're
Mm-hmm.
saving souls. His mental mindset was evil. It was fleshly. It was earthly. It was demonic, and he painted it with the patina of doing God's will and God's work, and not letting anybody get in the way of that. That's evil. I don't care
Yeah.
what anybody says. It's
Oh
evil,
yeah. No,
absolutely evil.
I've known so many people who really they will burn through leadership, and they don't care because they can always replace them. So they'll burn people out, they'll burn people over just to get their ministry done. Uh, I have stories about that. I used to joke about when I was living in Washington, there was a church I knew. There was it's almost like a style guide. There's a guide out there on how to take over a church, and I've seen it so many times. But the strategy was always the same. You come in, new leader, you get rid of all the existing leadership. You got to put your people in place. And it's so expected. A lot of people will resign when there's a senior pastor changeover. They'll just resign ahead of time because they know that they're going to get fired because it's a job. It's a job about power and maintaining systems of power.
I was driving across country for my first ministry job, and the pastor that I was going to work with gave me the Acts 29 tapes. And I'm telling you, I had to listen to those tapes as I drove across country. And the Acts 20, that's the Acts 29 model. It is their
Yeah.
stated model. So I'm not throwing anybody in the bus. That's exactly what they say to do. I was shocked by that. That's
Oh, yeah. That's
Machiavellian.
Mark Driscoll's
I will
whole
say this.
point of leadership. Yeah. But they want to name names, but since you brought up Acts
I will say this.
29, yeah.
I will say this. One of my favorite pastors totally embodied the opposite, and his name is Rob Salvato, and I'll just bring him up because he wouldn't make a move unless he consulted the Word, he consulted the Lord, and everybody agreed. If that meant that we lost, and he told me this, he told all of us guys in the meetings, that if that meant that we lost an opportunity to do something, then so be it. The
Mm-hmm.
staff wasn't there, the leadership wasn't there, so be it. And I, I can't say enough how much I learned about how to do things right under that guy, in opposition to so many other crazy things that
Yeah.
I've experienced. But there are people, and we don't want to be the negative nabobs of destruction. We really want to say that there are people out there that are doing it well. But the reality is this Machiavellian mindset is, and I'm sorry if I just got passionate about it, but this Machiavellian mindset that we see among ministry leaders is wicked.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think it's important people realize that we're not trying to pick specifically on those things. That not that there aren't good models, but this is Machiavelli, right? This is the book we're doing in review, in which I say, where do we see these things in the culture, whether they are politics? But we've got to be honest, we see it in the church. And so I think that people need to learn to be discerning when they enter churches. They find leaders that are willing to put on the externalities of virtue, like Machiavelli talked, but behind closed doors, they are brutal and thuggish leaders in many
Beasts.
ways. Yeah. So we just have to be aware that that is people. Some people teach that. Some people believe it, and they believe that is the way leaders should be. And that idea is not new. It goes back in time, and we can look to somebody like Machiavelli's The Prince to see why. All right, we have two last questions, and they're pretty. They're much faster. That was really the meat, the heart of a lot of stuff. But I do want to get to these last two questions, number 5 and 6 of our worldview questions. So, how will my life be judged? This is an important one. So when we think about the future in this worldview concept, for me, what I'm thinking is I just have three little points that I wrote down as I'm reading through Machiavelli and say, well, how will my life and my legacy be judged? Legacy is heirs to your throne, right? If you're the Pope, because remember, he's writing for Roman Catholic popes and cardinals. And also secular people too, but he's trying to please these Roman Catholic leaders who we see living these brutal lives, and he's lionizing some of the brutality of these people as well. But he's saying, well, legacy of heirs. Now, this isn't genetically speaking heirs, but do you get to appoint people who will carry on your name? Or in the case of the Medici family, does somebody within the house of Medici get elevated to those roles? Can you rule for generation after generation within that sort of, that's your legacy. That's how you'll know that God is on your side, so to speak, if you can pass on that rule. And I think today we see it in the concept of incumbency, right? We see it through party lines. Well, I don't care who I vote for as long as they're a Democrat, as long as they're a Republican. and we don't care about the virtue, the integrity, the qualities of that person as our leader, as long as they stay in. Or we hate Congress. Congress has like a 30% approval rate, but nobody gets rid of their representative. Nobody gets rid of their congressman or congresswoman, right? Because that's my incumbent. Well, yeah, sure. Generally, I hate them all, but at least the one in there is doing right by me, right? They're getting me stuff. Yeah, I hate that rule. I hate that we all care only about ourselves. But then again, my senator, my congressman does all right by me, so I'm going to keep them in. Incumbency is how we're judging that legacy of what they bring to me. And again, the outward appearance, I think, matters more than the actual actions. And we see that, I think, historically, more on the Democratic side, but I think that's true on the Republican side. As long as people hold up their Bible and say a few Jesus words and they say a
Yeah.
few platitudes and Christian virtues, we see this on both sides. I think we used to care more. I'd like to think we used to care more as Republicans about the actual integrity, but truth be told, these days, I don't think it matters on either side. Both sides have things that have to signal their virtue in certain ways. The progressive left has their own sort of externalities, but as long as you say the right thing, it's okay what you do. Your evil deeds don't matter. And I think the Republicans, quite frankly, are becoming more enamored with that sort of leadership.
This is the Dune question. I have in my notes here. You have the Harkonnens or Atreides, right? You have the Harkonnens or the Atreides. The Harkonnens, they are Machiavellian they represent Machiavelli, right? They are power and the pursuit of power. You also have, I can't remember, the Bene Gesserit, the witches, who are have their own Machiavellian machinations. And then you have the Atreides people who have the semblance of honor on their side, but they have their own desires as well. I mean, they have their own desires. It doesn't come out in the movies, but if you're familiar with Dune lore, they have their own desires as well. And then you have our real world that we live in, where you have the left and the right. And I think on the Republican side, I think that we've lost and moved away from the idealistic leader form that we've had in the past. And I can only tell you from my perspective, I love George W. Bush. I thought that George W. Bush was the exemplary Christian leader. That's what I thought, right? I believe that. But the more I grew in my Christian thought and the more mature I became, I realized that George W. Bush was playing us like a fiddle. And he knew exactly what to say. He knew exactly how to say it. He knew how it would be heard in the ears of those who followed him. And the whole time, he had no real goals to implement the so-called Christian values that he was all about and all for, especially in terms of abortion. I thought to myself, we got the House, we got the Senate, we got the presidency, and we even have a Republican leaning Supreme Court. It's time to do away with abortion. It's time to do it. You got it. In your second election, you got it. And you know what? It was never his intent to get rid of abortion. As a matter of fact, as it comes out as he's getting out of office, we find that everybody in his family, his wife, his daughters, his dad, all were pro-choice people.
Yeah.
And I think that contributes to the disillusionment. And then we end up with Trump. The first time Trump ran, I was never Trump to the casket drop. Anybody that knew me then said I knew that I was not going to vote for, this clown. And here's what happens. He gets elected. I don't feel that I owe him any allegiance or any loyalty because I didn't vote for him. I could view him objectively. And what I saw was someone who was at least trying or attempting to carry out what he believed. Now, with a person like Trump, you're going to get foolishness. Don't go to the circus and expect not to see clowns, right? You're going to get it. But what's happened over the last 4 years, I believe that we've just been pushed to a place where the temptation is to destroy our enemies, to crush them under our feet, and hear the lamentation of the women. The
Yeah.
Conan,
I got your reference there, Conan.
I feel the Conan ethos. That we're being pushed to this place, and I don't want to be in either this place, I would prefer the right kind of leader to rule. And I don't want to lay down my principles. I don't want to be, as we talked about, Machiavellian here. But I can feel the tension, the so-called realist perspective of someone like a Machiavelli saying, but now look, Leroy, you want nobility in your leaders. You want God honoring people in office, and you're not going to get them. What do you do now? Do you lay down your principles right now at this time in history to get what you want, to get even, to destroy these people? That's the temptation that we all face, isn't it? Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to
Oh
say,
no, I
please
was
go.
going to say, but I think that's where that legacy question, Machiavelli's legacy is maintaining, keeping power, but we have to decide what our legacy is going to be based on our worldview, right? And are we willing to suffer losses politically for the sake of some other ideal or virtue? And that's what we have to balance. And we have to figure that out. And, we're not going to answer all that here necessarily, but I do think that's the thing that when you going through these different philosophical treatises, as we'll be doing over the months, we'll look at Descartes coming up, and we'll look at Hobbes, and we'll look at all these sort of things. But we're going to have to, the goal here is to try to figure out what are the worldview of these people, but how does this fit in with a biblical Christian worldview, and what worldview are you really living? And
Right.
that's the tension that you're bringing up right here. That's super important. I want to get, because I don't want to go too much longer though. The last worldview question: what happens when I die? This was, obviously I'm kind of making some inference because Machiavelli doesn't cover this in his book, but to be sort of complete in that worldview analysis, what happens in the end? Well, I think for Machiavelli, this idea of the kingdom, I don't think he really ever talks about a kingdom to come. He never speaks about, how we're accountable to God and the life yet to come. There's no sense of anything life beyond the here and now. Everything is life here and now. Now, maybe he held to that personally, I don't know, but his writings were pretty clear. It's all about the here and now. It's all about your legacy, and it's all about power, keeping and maintaining and passing that on. It's a very much, I think, a political dystopia that he's advocating for. It's a very dystopian political reality that we're just in this eternal cycle. And I think this is actually where Marx later up in this idea of his working towards a communist utopia come in, where we're creating our future reality of what we want to be. Now, Machiavelli doesn't really go there, but I think that's when you look at that Marxist ideology, which we'll do in December. But I think you see the outworking of where Machiavelli's framework opens the door to that, what happens in the future. Well, we create our own kingdom to come. And the last point I have is this, and I would just get any of your thoughts on these or your own. The word came to mind. What has to that? We're political zombies. I like the word
Mhm.
zombies. We're not driven by we're not driven though by a lust to eat flesh, but a lust to see our enemies defeated or dead. It's that Conan sort of thing. The orange man bad mentality. That's the future. The future is, who can I defeat? I want to see my enemies defeated. That's what happens, and then I'll die. But I'm going to leave a legacy and make sure that I defeated my enemies. And you can see the trail of my enemies behind me, and that's what we'll put on our tombstones. Here I lie, and the enemies I defeated are listed here, kind of thing. That's all I see in Machiavelli.
Yeah, if you follow a Machiavellian mindset and you really adopt it for how you live, there's an old meme that goes straight to jail, straight to jail. You're going straight to hell. If you try to live out a Machiavellian worldview and that mindset and the belief, you're going straight to hell.
All right, well, let's do this. Final thoughts, Leroy. How can
Yeah,
our brothers and sisters listening use this information to cultivate the culture and sow the seed of the gospel? What's something, our big takeaway we can say, like, okay, I learned from this. I'm going to sort of mine the culture. I'm going to work with my friends. I'm going to till that soil of culture. How can we sow the seed of the gospel in this context that we are living out a lot of this Machiavellian politics?
Jesus' way is the upside down way. The way to power is servanthood. And those who pursue power, they may get it, but they're going to reap destruction. And we have to say to ourselves, what good is it if we gain the whole world, if we get everything we want in the world, but we lose our souls in the process? That's what the Machiavellian way is tempting us to do. It's tempting us to get our legitimate needs met illegitimately. And that's sin.
Amen, brother. All I'll say to add to that is, what can we do specifically to cultivate the culture and sow the seed of the gospel? We have to live this way as a church first. We can't even imagine that we're going to transform the culture and society. Who wins elections won't change the culture. And I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. All I'm saying is the thing we can control, right? We can't control who gets elected because I'm only one vote among many. I can't control if they're faithful to the promises they make. What I can control is what I choose to do, the way I choose to live, and the community, the church I choose to live with and in and through. And so, folks, we've got to pick a church that is not leading in this Machiavellian lifestyle. We've got to find leaders that'll do it right and do it healthy. And then we're going to have to live that out. And then people will see, hey, I'm not seeing this world, but I see it in the life of your church, right? And that's what we're going to have to see. There's a lot more that could be said about Machiavelli, the prince, and how it's influenced our politics and even the life of the church. But for now, I want to encourage you to go out and raise the roof on these Machiavellian leaders in your life, in your churches, and in your communities. And I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.